The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical's emergency department buzz like angry insects, a sound Rachel Torres has learned to filter out the way soldiers learn to ignore artillery. She moves through the controlled chaos of Atlanta's busiest ER at 11:11 p.m. on a Tuesday, her scrubs pristine despite 6 hours of trauma admissions, her movements economical, nothing wasted, nothing flashy. She doesn't rush. Rushing is how mistakes happen. She's learned that lesson in places that don't appear on her resume. Her left leg carries a pronounced limp, a permanent souvenir from an IED that killed 2 of her team in Helmand Province 4 years ago. The limp is invisible to most people because Rachel moves in a way that makes you look at her hands instead, hands that know exactly where they're going before her brain finishes deciding. Hands steady as surgical lasers. Those hands are calloused in specific places. The webbing between thumb and forefinger on her right hand has a particular thickness that comes from holding pressure bandages through 18-hour surgical marathons. Most nurses' hands don't look like that. The ER smells like it always does, antiseptic layered over stale coffee and something vaguely metallic that Rachel has stopped trying to identify. She scrubbed in on 37 emergency procedures in her 14 weeks as a temp assignment here, and her scrubs carry the ghost of all of them. Tonight, a stabbing victim made it through initial resuscitation. A 62-year-old with a STEMI is headed to the catheterization lab. A child with a compound fracture is waiting for orthopedics. The work is ceaseless and necessary, and Rachel moves through it like someone who has seen far worse. At the nurse's station, she documents vitals with the same precision she uses for everything: blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, all entered in the electronic medical record with no flourishes and no errors. An attending physician named Dr. Patterson watches her from across the station, his eyes narrowing slightly. He's seen something most people miss. Rachel catches his gaze for half a second, long enough to register the question forming in his mind, then looks away. Questions about credentials are questions she's learned not to answer. Torres. His voice is friendly but curious. Where did you train? Your wound prep on the trauma case was textbook. Actually, better than textbook. Rachel doesn't look up from the chart. Here and there. Couple of programs, some independent study. It's technically true. Fort Sam Houston's Medical Education and Training Center counts as a program. 3 tours in theater count as independent study. The Kandahar surgical facility where she spent 8 months assisting on 34 trauma cases in a converted warehouse counts as somewhere. She's learned to answer questions without lying while saying nothing that matters. Well, wherever it was, they trained you right. Patterson moves past her, and the moment dissolves. She files the interaction away, another close call avoided, and moves toward room 314, where a new admission needs vitals checked. The chart says Sergeant Davis, Army, admitted from the VA clinic with documented injuries from a deployment to Kandahar that ended 18 months ago. 34 years old. A lump of shrapnel still lodged in his left shoulder blade, operable but stable, low priority. Rachel has seen the names and dates 1,000 times, but something about this one makes her pause. Kandahar. She hasn't had a direct connection to a Kandahar case since she left. She pushes through the door of room 314 with her portable vitals cart, and the man in the hospital bed looks up. Sergeant Davis has the kind of stillness that only comes from military training or trauma or both. His eyes are dark, intelligent, and they track her movement the way people track things they've learned to survive by watching. His left arm is bandaged from wrist to elbow, the dressing fresh but several days old. There's a small, precise scar visible on his neck, just below his jaw, the kind of scar that comes from field medicine, not civilian surgery. Evening, Sergeant, Rachel says, and her voice drops into the cadence she uses for patients, professional, calm, the vocal equivalent of a steady hand. Just need to check your vitals again. She wraps the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and economical. She doesn't chatter. She doesn't ask about his injuries or his deployment or his life. She simply works, and her hands move with a fluidity that comes from doing the same procedures hundreds of times under circumstances where speed and accuracy meant whether someone went home or went home in a flag-draped box. The cuff hisses as it inflates. 118/76. Solid. She makes a note, takes his temperature with the temporal thermometer, 98.3, normal, and reaches for his wrist to check his radial pulse. Her fingers find it, count the beats, and she's about to release him when his hand moves. Not defensive. Just aware. "Your technique," Davis says quietly. His voice is hoarse from weeks of breathing tubes and recovery. That's not standard civilian nursing. Rachel doesn't freeze. Freezing is an admission. Instead, she finishes counting his pulse, 71 beats per minute, steady, strong, and makes the notation on his chart. She's about to straighten when Davis continues, his eyes locked on hers now with the intensity of someone who has learned to read a room by looking at one person. I've seen that exact hand position in Kandahar. In the surgical tents. The way you stabilize the pulse point, the pressure you apply, the angle of your fingers. He pauses. That's field medicine. That's not civilian. The room goes very quiet. Rachel can hear the ventilator hissing from the room next door, the muted beeping of a monitor 2 doors down, the distant sound of a hospital intercom calling a code to another floor. She meets his eyes, and she makes a choice. There's something in his face that says he already knows. Soldiers recognize other soldiers. It's a frequency only certain people hear. "Rest well, Sergeant," she says, and her voice doesn't change. "Your vitals look good. Pain management is available if you need it." She doesn't answer his question. She doesn't confirm or deny. She simply says what needs saying and moves to leave the room. But Davis's next words stop her, not with their volume but with their precision. 10 Mountain. His voice is so quiet it almost disappears into the machine sounds. "I was thinking 10th Mountain when I saw your hands." Rachel's hand pauses on the door frame for exactly 1 second, no tremor, no visible reaction, just a momentary stillness. Then she pushes the door open and steps into the hallway without responding. Behind her, she hears Davis exhale, a small sound that might be satisfaction or might be recognition. She needs to move. She needs to put distance between herself and that room because Davis has just done what no one else at Cedar Creek Medical has done. He's seen her. Not the temp nurse. Not the quiet, competent woman who shows up for 12-hour shifts and asks no questions and leaves without drama. He's seen the person underneath, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, worn smooth by years she never mentions. At the nurse's station, she updates Davis's chart with methodical precision, vitals entered, notes documented, everything in order. Her breathing is steady. Her hands are steady. This is what she's trained for, the ability to compartmentalize, to function while information reorganizes itself in her mind. Davis knows. That creates complications, but complications can be managed. That's when she sees him. Dr. Mercer approaches the nurse's station with the kind of casual authority that comes from knowing you've never been questioned. He's tall, silver-haired, wearing designer glasses and a white coat that has probably never been worn in an actual emergency. 58, maybe 60, the kind of physician who prefers administrative meetings to floor rounds. His eyes move across the station until they land on Rachel, and something shifts in his expression. Not anger. Calculation. He's been watching her. Rachel realizes this with the clarity of someone trained to notice surveillance. He's been watching her competence, her relationship with patients, the way attending physicians occasionally ask her where she trained. He's been watching all of it and making assessments, the way apex predators assess prey, not with hunger but with the cold evaluation of whether something is a threat to territory. Mercer picks up a chart, not Davis's, and pretends to read it while his eyes stay fixed on Rachel. She feels the weight of his attention the way you feel weather changing before a storm. She doesn't look directly at him. Looking directly at people in power when they're deciding whether you're a problem is a good way to become one. She moves past his line of sight toward the medication dispensary, and she catches a phrase as he speaks into his phone, his voice low and casual. Not a full credential, she's temp staff, just wondering about her background. He pauses, listening to whoever is on the other end. Yeah, no, just curious. She's fine, technically sound, but something's off about her profile. Rachel continues moving, her pace unchanged, her breathing unchanged. This is the beginning of something. She recognizes the pattern. This is how suspicion starts, not with accusations but with questions, not with confrontation but with phone calls to people who keep files. She finishes her tasks methodically, charting, medication administration, patient checks, and by the time her 12-hour shift ends at 7:16 a.m., Cedar Creek Medical's day shift is rolling in like a changing of the guard. Rachel changes out of her scrubs in the locker room, where the metal door hisses and closes with a sound like relief. She pulls on regular clothes, jeans, a long-sleeved shirt that hides the scars on her forearms, a jacket worn soft with age. Her jacket is the kind you find in surplus stores, army green, and inside the lining, stitched so precisely that it won't be found unless someone is specifically looking, is a patch. Faded, worn, the edges slightly frayed. 10th Mountain Division. It's been her anchor for 8 years, the small physical proof that who she was before matters, that those years meant something, that the weight she carries has a name. She touches it once before zipping the jacket, muscle memory more than thought, and heads toward the parking lot where rain is beginning to fall, slow at first, then harder, drumming against the concrete like applause no one asked for. Her car is a 5-year-old Honda, practical and forgettable. She starts the engine, and as she pulls out of the parking lot, she thinks about Sergeant Davis and the recognition in his eyes. What happened next didn't just change Rachel's assignment at Cedar Creek Medical. It changed everything. Grand rounds on Thursday morning hit like a briefing before a hostile insertion. The Cedar Creek Medical Conference Room held 28 residents and nurses arranged theater-style, coffee cups steaming, eyes fixed on the projection screen. Dr. Mercer stood center stage with the clinical presence of a man who'd never doubted his own importance, tailored jacket, monogrammed cuffs, the kind of surgeon's hands that hadn't touched a patient in 7 years. Rachel stood against the back wall in her scrubs, badge clipped to her collar, body language projecting the disinterest of someone checking email during a staff meeting. Mercer clicked to the first slide. Rachel's name appeared in the corner of a patient chart. "Let me show you what happens when we lower our standards," Mercer began, his voice carrying the clinical precision of a man reading test results to students who'd never question his interpretation. He highlighted the entries from her earlier that week, a needle decompression technique, the angles, the depth, the timing. "Ms. Torres here used an unorthodox approach that contradicts our established protocols. This is exactly why temporary staff shouldn't handle critical procedures." The words landed soft but practiced, the way a surgeon plants a blade. "We hire professionals, not body fillers from staffing agencies." Rachel's jaw tightened. That was all. No blush, no defensive shift, no audible breath. Her eyes remained flat, the color of burnished steel, the kind of stare that came from having spent time in rooms where looking away meant dying first. A young resident in the third row raised his hand. "Did the patient survive?" Mercer waved the question like cigarette smoke. "Irrelevant to proper technique. The point is protocol compliance, not outcomes." He advanced 3 more slides, each one dissecting her movements frame by frame. 2 minutes later, he moved on to other cases, but the damage was architectural, carefully laid, professionally executed, exactly the kind of sabotage that didn't leave fingerprints. Rachel watched him return to his seat and thought about field hospitals in Kandahar, about the commanding officer who tried to pull rank during a convoy ambush when patients were bleeding out in the sand. She'd ignored him then. She'd ignore this now. The coffee machine on the second floor hummed its mechanical rhythm around 2 o'clock. Rachel fed in $3, selected black coffee, and waited for the cup to drop with a plastic thunk. She was turning away when Mercer approached from the left corridor, 3 nurses trailing like satellites caught in his gravitational pull. "Tell me, temp," Mercer said loudly enough to carry down the entire hallway, deliberate, calculated, the acoustic violence of a man who wanted an audience. "Did you actually pass your boards or did you just memorize enough to fool the agency?" He smiled like a wolf showing its teeth. The 3 nurses suddenly became very interested in their shoes, playing the role of bystanders at a public execution because objecting would mark them as disloyal. Rachel's fingers tightened on the coffee cup. The paper sleeve crumpled. Her knuckles went white, not from fear, but from the trembling restraint of a woman who'd been trained to break men twice this size without leaving evidence. She turned slowly, locked her eyes on his, and held the stare for exactly 3 seconds. When she spoke, her voice dropped 2 octaves. Controlled. Surgical. Your insecurity is showing, doctor. Maybe check your own credentials before questioning mine. She turned on her heel and walked away without waiting for response, her pace unhurried, her posture upright, the physical language of someone who'd already won before the first word left her mouth. Mercer stood frozen, his 3 satellite nurses suddenly aware they'd witnessed something they shouldn't have. His face flushed crimson. His jaw clenched. For the first time that shift, he'd reached for leverage and come away empty. That made him twice as dangerous. The afternoon descended into the rhythm of routine, blood pressure cuffs, for insertions, charting that stretched into evening. Rachel moved through Cedar Creek Medical like water finding cracks, making herself smaller with each passing hour, each task completed without complaint. Around 5 o'clock, she was restocking the supply closet near room 312 when Mercer appeared, blocking the exit with his body weight and intention. I don't appreciate your attitude, temp. His voice had lowered now, the volume controlled, which made it worse. A quiet threat carried more weight than shouting ever could. One more incident of insubordination and I'll have security escort you out of this building. I've terminated better nurses than you for less. He stood close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive and suffocating. Rachel's jaw clenched. A vein became visible at her temple, the physical evidence of pressure building behind her eyes. She simply nodded once and turned on her heel, squeezing past him into the corridor, leaving the supply closet half-finished. She could feel his satisfaction radiating behind her like heat from a furnace. In the corridor's bathroom, she locked the stall and stood motionless for 47 seconds, breathing through her nose in controlled increments. This was what the training prepared for, not the violence, but the silence. Not the explosions, but the slow suffocation of institutional power applied with precision. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the stall door and texted her handler, "Cover may be compromised." The response took 90 seconds. Maintain position. Davis intel critical. 48 hours. 48 hours. She had less than 2 days to hold together a cover that was splintering at the edges. The evening shift brought her to room 314 where Sergeant Davis lay recovering from Kandahar injuries that surgeons still didn't fully understand. Rachel changed his dressing with the efficiency of someone who'd done this intense with artillery falling nearby, a movements economical, precise, practiced to the point of appearing almost casual. The fur in his arm needed inspection and rotation. She approached with the needle poised at a 45-degree angle, her left hand stabilizing the site with the kind of pressure that came from muscle memory. Davis watched her hands. Not her face, not her badge, but her hands. His eyes narrowed with the recognition of someone who'd seen field medicine practiced under fire. "That's a combat insertion technique," he whispered. The other 2 patients in the shared room were sleeping. The machines hummed their separate songs. 45-degree angle, military needle, left-hand stabilization, I've only seen that in field hospitals. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, the kind a soldier makes when he's identifying enemy movement in the distance. Rachel's hands froze for half a second. Not long enough for him to see it, but long enough for her to know the moment had arrived, the moment when 3 years of undercover work balanced on a needle point. I trained under a former army nurse, she said quietly, her voice deliberately vague, projecting the kind of uncertainty that a civilian temp nurse might legitimately possess. But the deflection carried no conviction. Both of them recognized the performance. Davis studied her then, the limp that favored her right leg, the calluses on her hands that cleaning supplies couldn't explain, the way her eyes unconsciously scanned the room's exits and windows like someone measuring tactical positioning. "You're no civilian nurse." "Which unit?" His voice dropped to match hers, a soldier speaking to a soldier. Rachel met his eyes. A silent understanding passed between them, the kind that needed no words, that existed in the space between people who'd seen the same things and survived by the same calculations. She glanced at the hallway camera mounted above the door, adjusted his blanket with deliberate purpose, and murmured so quietly only he could hear, "This conversation doesn't leave this room, Sergeant." Davis nodded slowly, a single incline of his head. "Understood." The honorific landed differently now, not a courtesy, but an acknowledgement. "Meant officer." "Meant rank." That afternoon, Mercer began his strategic campaign in earnest. He called the staffing agency at 3:15, his voice smooth as oil. "I have some concerns about our temporary nurses' continued placement. Competence issues. Attitude problems. I'm going to be reviewing her file before her next shift." He listened for 10 seconds, then, "Yes, I understand. I just need to make sure we're protecting patient safety." The call lasted 40 seconds total. It accomplished everything. By 4 o'clock, he'd altered next week's schedule with the precision of a chess player removing pieces from the board. Rachel's name disappeared from all critical assignments: no trauma bay, no ICU, no emergency procedures. Instead, she was scheduled for administrative work, data entry, the kind of assignments that slowly suffocated a nurse's credibility. By tomorrow morning, the hospital would be whispering that she'd been benched for a reason. By 4:30, Mercer had sent identical emails to 3 department chiefs at competing hospitals in Atlanta, casual mentions buried in professional pleasantries: "You should know we've had some concerns, nothing formal yet, just thought you'd want to be aware before she tries to transfer." The words would travel faster than any official complaint ever could. Rachel discovered the schedule change at 5:42 when she checked her hospital email on her phone during break. The new assignments loaded on her screen like a closing door. She recognized the pattern: isolation before termination, the methodical dismantling of credibility that made firing her impossible to challenge. This was how institutional violence worked. Not with screaming, but with scheduling adjustments. She texted her handler, "Cover may be compromised. Davis is asking questions." The response came back immediately, timed at 5:49, "Maintain position. Davis intel critical. 48 hours. 48 hours. Rachel stared at the screen while rain began hammering against the hospital windows outside, and understood that she was trapped between 2 impossible calculations: the mission that required her to stay, and the professional devastation waiting if she did. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The rain started that morning, the kind that hammered Atlanta's asphalt like a countdown nobody wanted to hear. Rachel stood in her apartment, staring at her phone while water streaked the kitchen window. The message from her handler was 3 words: "Davis unstable. Monitor him." She knew what that meant. 2 days. 48 hours until the extraction window closed, until the operation either succeeded or died in the bureaucracy of Cedar Creek Medical. The intelligence Davis carried, names, dates, the structure of a cell planning to hit the embassy in Kabul, had a shelf life measured in hours now, not weeks. That's when her personal phone buzzed. The scheduling app showing her name removed from tomorrow's roster. Strike that. Removed from all critical floors. A notation from Dr. Mercer: Torres reassigned to administrative support pending review. Rachel didn't smile. Smiling would have been a luxury. Instead, she pulled on civilian clothes, dark jeans, a charcoal jacket with the unit patch sewn into the lining, right over her heart where nobody would ever look, and checked her hospital badge. Still valid. Still active. Mercer didn't have the authority to revoke it, not yet anyway. The drive to Cedar Creek took 20 minutes through traffic that moved like congealed blood. She'd been coming to this hospital for 3 weeks as a temp, pushing medication carts and taking blood pressures, invisible the way invisible people were supposed to be. But today she wasn't coming as a nurse. Today she was coming as something else entirely. The parking garage swallowed her car at 7:11 a.m. Rachel moved through the concrete levels with the kind of economy of motion that came from 17 years of living in places where wasted energy meant death. Her credentials got her past the badge reader on the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and industrial floor wax, the same smell that lived in field hospitals in Kandahar, the same smell that would never quite leave her skin. She had paperwork. An actual folder of shift reports she'd left in the office, a legitimate reason to be here on her day off. The lie was clean. The lie was necessary. The lie would probably end her career the moment Mercer found out. The nurse's station on the critical care floor was chaos in fluorescent lighting. 3 code situations developing simultaneously. A resident named Chen, first year, hands too nervous for the weight they were carrying, was juggling admits like someone trying to catch falling glass. Rachel set the folder down on the corner desk, close enough to see the vital signs monitors without appearing to watch them. Room 314. Sergeant Davis. The monitor showed his oxygen saturation at 94%, respiration at 22%, heart rate elevated but stable. For now. She'd reviewed his chart during the previous shift. Tension pneumothorax risk factors were stacked like ammunition. Blunt chest trauma from an IED blast 3 years ago. Compromised lung capacity. And now, according to the lab results she'd glimpsed, his pleural pressure was trending upward. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said. Chen. The resident. Not hostile, just distracted, his attention already half gone to the other emergencies, the way attention always splintered in rooms like this. Rachel turned, her expression neutral as concrete. "Left some paperwork. I'm on my way out." Dr. Mercer left specific instructions. Chen's jaw tightened. "You're not to touch critical patients. Not until the review is finished." She didn't argue. Arguing would have been memorable. Instead, she picked up the folder and moved to the side, positioning herself where she could still see the monitor for room 314. Her hands looked steady. Everything about her looked steady. It was the skill that had kept her alive through 3 tours, the ability to appear calm while her nervous system ran threat assessments like a computer running diagnostics. Davis's oxygen dropped to 92%. Then 88%. The monitor's alarm didn't sound yet because alarms had thresholds, and Davis was still above his. But Rachel had learned in places where there were no thresholds, no safety margins, no room for gradual deterioration. She'd learned to read the body's language before it started screaming. She watched Chen glance at the monitor, make a mental note, and return to the phone call he was managing. A liver transplant coordination. Critical. Legitimate. The kind of call that consumed attention like a fire consuming oxygen. "Room 314 needs attention," Rachel said quietly. Not an order. A suggestion. A statement of fact. Chen waved a hand without looking. "He's stable." Stable. The word sat between them like something dead. Rachel's jaw clenched once, quick, the kind of movement most people wouldn't notice. But she stepped back. She waited. She watched the monitor display the numbers of a man whose chest was filling with air, whose lungs were being compressed, whose body was beginning the process of shutting down. Oxygen at 86%. The alarm finally screamed, 3 sharp electronic bursts that cut through the hallway like a knife. Davis's monitor showed the truth that vital signs had been predicting: oxygen dropping, heart rate spiking to 142, blood pressure starting its catastrophic descent. Rachel saw Chen's posture change, saw the moment recognition arrived and panic followed. His hands reached for the phone with trembling fingers, but he was moving through water, everything too slow, everything arriving too late. Rachel was already moving. She didn't run. Running would have drawn attention, would have made her memorable. Instead, she moved with the kind of controlled precision that came from having moved through Kandahar's trauma wards where noise meant incoming, where speed meant survival, where hesitation meant decisions made by gravity instead of human hands. Room 314. Davis's bed. The door frame passing her shoulder. "Tension pneumothorax," she said, her voice dropping an octave, dropping into the register that came from somewhere deeper than civilian nursing. "Move." Chen stepped back like he'd been shoved, and maybe he had been, maybe the sheer certainty in those 2 words carried more force than hands ever could. Rachel was already reaching for the supply cart, her fingers finding the needle without looking. 14-gauge angiocath. The kind of needle that could mean the difference between Davis living and Davis becoming a body that would later require paperwork to explain. You can't just, Chen started. She wasn't listening. Her hands were moving on their own now, muscle memory from a level of consciousness that had no interest in hospital protocol or Dr. Mercer's instructions. She located the space, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was the same in every human who'd ever drawn breath. The urgency was the same whether you were in a field hospital with mortar rounds landing 300 meters away or in an air-conditioned room in Atlanta with fluorescent lights hissing overhead. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. She'd heard it before in rooms without antibiotics, without proper ventilation, without any of the armor that civilian medicine wore. The hiss meant the pressure differential was breaking, meant Davis's chest was beginning to re-inflate, meant the window between catastrophe and recovery had just narrowed to something measurable. Oxygen at 78%. Then 82%. Then 88%, climbing like a ladder back toward something that resembled survival. "Get me a catheter to secure," Rachel said, and Chen moved because that tone of voice was the kind that preceded court-martial or commendation, and civilians still responded to it even when they didn't understand why. Oxygen running wide open. "I need a chest X-ray stat, and someone needs to call the attending physician." "Dr. Mercer is in his office," Chen said, and Rachel heard it then, the small note of fear in that statement. Not fear of the medical crisis. Fear of something else. Fear of what would happen when the attending arrived and found his temp nurse, the one he'd specifically forbidden from touching critical patients, standing over an emergency with a needle in her hand and a patient climbing back toward viability. 94%. 96%. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Regular. Steady. The kind of rhythm that meant the heart remembered how to work without the chest crushing it. Davis's eyes fluttered open. His mouth worked. Nothing came out yet, but his pupils were responding, his body was coming back, the crisis that had arrived like a thief was being dismantled one decision at a time. Rachel pulled off her gloves and turned to face the hallway just as feet were already approaching. Fast feet. Authoritative feet. The kind of feet that belonged to someone who'd been called to witness a violation of explicit orders. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway wearing the expression of a man who'd been given a gift wrapped in exactly the consequences he'd been waiting for. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. Because Rachel could feel her cover already dissolving like sugar in water, could feel the calculation changing on Mercer's face, the moment when he realized that a temp nurse didn't move with that kind of precision, didn't know that particular needle insertion without hesitation, didn't have hands that had held more lives together than most surgeons ever would. The moment when he started doing the mathematics of what she was, and every equation he solved brought him closer to an answer that would change everything. Dr. Mercer arrived within 4 minutes of Chen's panic page, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the precision of someone accustomed to commanding spaces simply by occupying them. He stopped in the threshold of Trauma Bay 3, taking in the scene with the calculating eye of a man trained to recognize vulnerabilities. Sergeant Davis was breathing, color restored, O2 sat climbing steadily on the monitor. Rachel stood beside the crash cart, packing the emergency needle kit with movement so practiced they barely registered as human. Her hands moved like machines executing their final function. "You performed an invasive procedure," Mercer said quietly, stepping into the room. Not a question. A pronouncement. While off duty. While explicitly restricted from patient care. Rachel didn't look up. She sealed the needle in its plastic sleeve with methodical precision, every motion designed to communicate absolute indifference to his presence. That's not insubordination, Torres. That's criminal negligence. That's practicing medicine without, he paused, watching her face for the crack he expected. It didn't come. You understand what you've just done. She understood perfectly. 6 months of intelligence work, dissolved. An entire operation, compromised. A 6-person team in Kandahar, monitoring a network she'd been embedded to penetrate, now operating blind because the asset she was protecting had blown her operational security into pieces. Mercer was calculating something in that moment. She could see it in the slight narrowing of his pupils, the way his jaw worked like he was solving an equation. He was beginning to do the mathematics of what she was, and every number he crunched brought him closer to an answer that would reshape everything. Chen appeared in the doorway, still holding the phone like it had transformed into something dangerous. "Dr. Mercer, I tried to page you sooner, but the code happened so fast and she was already here, She was here," Mercer interrupted, his voice smooth as oil spreading across water, off the clock, without authorization, "and she performed a procedure that carries a liability exposure of approximately $3 million in federal malpractice sanctions if anything goes sideways." He smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who'd witnessed a miracle. It was the smile of a man who'd just been handed exactly the weapon he needed. "Call hospital administration. I want this documented in writing within the hour. And page security, I want her escorted from the building." Rachel closed the emergency kit with a decisive click. The sound cut through the room like punctuation at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to hear. She didn't argue. Any defense would require explanation. Any explanation would require context. Any context would detonate the entire operation. 6 months of surveillance, intelligence gathering, asset cultivation, all of it sitting behind her teeth like a secret she wasn't authorized to share. The faded 10th Mountain Division patch, sewn inside her jacket lining in a hospital locker 3 floors below, was worth more than her career. It had to be. The mission demanded it. Within the hour, Mercer executed his trilogy of destruction with the precision of a man who'd spent years building exactly this kind of institutional power. First call went to the staffing agency, terminate her contract effective immediately. No notice period, no final check processing. "I'm citing gross violations of patient care protocols and putting it in writing." The staffing director tried to object, something about paperwork, about severance. Mercer cut him off. "Do you want to be named in the liability waiver, or do you want to let this go away quietly?" The second call went to hospital administration. Mercer used words like unauthorized procedures, gross negligence, federal liability, and immediate termination with cause. He talked about his legal team. He mentioned precedent. He made it sound like keeping Rachel employed was a path to institutional catastrophe. The third call was the one that burned everything down. Dr. Mercer had cultivated relationships over 23 years, hospital chiefs from Jacksonville to Charlotte, department heads in Nashville and Birmingham, a network of surgeons and administrators who owed him favors, who respected his reputation, who would return a call when he needed something destroyed. He made 6 calls in that third wave, each one planting the same seed. "Just wanted to give you a heads up about a temp nurse who performed unauthorized procedures at my facility. Lovely credentials on paper, but clearly unstable. If she applies to your institution, I'd recommend extreme caution. Professional courtesy." By the time Rachel's termination paperwork was being processed, by the time her access badge was being deactivated, by the time the final "do not rehire" annotation was being entered into the hospital system, Dr. Mercer had already begun his public campaign of erasure. He'd removed her from the staffing roles. He'd poisoned every reference. He'd made sure that Cedar Creek Medical would be the last hospital in Atlanta, possibly the last hospital in the Southeast, that would ever take a chance on her. Rachel signed the termination documents at 6:41 p.m., her hand steady enough that nobody in HR would notice they were shaking for entirely different reasons. Not from fear. From restraint. From the enormous discipline required not to explain that monitoring Davis had been her actual assignment, that Army intelligence had placed her at Cedar Creek specifically to protect him, that the faded patch inside her jacket lining meant she'd served in the same unit he'd served in, that blowing her cover meant a 6-month intelligence operation died with her employment, that Mercer had just destroyed not her career, but a mission that was preventing the kind of attacks that put soldiers in hospital beds. She couldn't say any of it. The mission came first. The mission always came first. That was what the patch meant. That was what 10th Mountain stitched into her jacket lining really cost. The evening was thick with Atlanta humidity when she drove home, still in her civilian clothes from the hospital, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and the particular ozone scent that clung to defibrillator paddles. The apartment was dark. The kitchen light flickered on, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum. Rachel sat at the table, the same table where Emma did her homework, where they ate breakfast together on weekends, where normal things happened for normal people living normal lives. She sat in the chair closest to the window, where the city lights filtered through in tired geometric patterns. The tears came quietly. Not the kind that involved sound or gasping or the kind of breaking that other people noticed. Just the kind that tracked slowly down her face while her shoulders moved in a rhythm almost like breathing but somehow different, somehow weighted with 6 months of intelligence gathering and 3 tours of Kandahar and 14 soldiers who'd been alive because of her hands and one 8-year-old daughter who deserved a mother who got to come home at the normal time instead of destroyed in ways nobody could see. Emma found her at 8:15 p.m., still in the civilian clothes, still in that chair, still in that state of controlled dissolution that looked from the outside like a woman sitting at a kitchen table and nothing more. Emma's footsteps were soft, she was already in her pajamas, already supposed to be in bed, already carrying that particular gravity that children developed when they recognized that something had broken in the world. "Mommy." The voice was so small it barely occupied the space it moved through. "Why are you home so early?" Rachel pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and sleep, unable to explain that some sacrifices had to be made in silence, that the kind of strength that mattered most was the kind nobody got to witness, that the faded unit patch inside her jacket lining had cost her something tonight but had saved something else, something bigger, something that would only be visible to people with security clearances and classified access and reasons to know what she'd been doing at Cedar Creek Medical all along. She didn't answer Emma's question. She just held her, shoulders still moving in that quiet rhythm, while outside the window Atlanta glittered indifferently and somewhere in a Pentagon office building a handler was reading a report that said the operation had been compromised and somewhere in a hospital room Sergeant Davis was breathing because of someone who'd just sacrificed everything to keep him alive. Hospital HR was processing the termination paperwork when the background check flagged a classified security clearance that required Pentagon verification. The administrator had seen a lot of things in 30 years at Cedar Creek Medical, but a security flag on a contract nurse wasn't one of them. She pulled the document up twice, thinking the system had glitched. It hadn't. The clearance code started with letters that meant military intelligence, the kind that didn't appear in civilian hospitals. She was reaching for her supervisor's phone when the doors to the administrative wing burst open. 2 military policemen in dress uniforms appeared in the hallway, not running, not hurried, but moving with the kind of purposeful precision that made every administrator in a 50-foot radius straighten their spine. Behind them came a man in army dress blues, shoulders broad as a cargo door, with the insignia of a 2-star general on his collar. The hallway traffic stopped. Nurses turned. A doctor actually stepped back against the wall to let them pass. Dr. Mercer was announcing Rachel's dismissal to a gathered group of staff, his voice steady, his tone clinical, his word choice precise. Insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. Breach of protocol. The words came out like a surgeon's findings at a mortality conference, and he was watching the faces of his colleagues, noting which ones nodded and which ones looked uncertain. He was building consensus, anchoring the narrative before anyone could question it. Strategic. Calculated. The kind of systematic character assassination that had worked on Rachel because she had no platform to defend herself. The general stopped directly in front of Mercer's audience, and the room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. "Dr. Mercer," the general said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even spoken loudly. It was the kind of voice that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed across radio frequencies and through helicopter noise and in the aftermath of explosions, a voice that didn't need volume because it carried the weight of command. "I need you to stop speaking now." In the hospital bed 3 floors down, Sergeant Davis heard the commotion through the intercom system and pressed the call button. The nurse who answered found him struggling to sit up, his face still gray with recovery, but his eyes sharp. "Get me to the hallway," he said. "Now." By the time they wheeled him out, Rachel was standing in the center of that hallway in her scrubs, looking exactly as she had that first day, composed, quiet, her hand steady at her sides. The general was still there. A Marine colonel was reading from his phone, his voice carrying the official cadence of military citations. Captain Rachel Torres, Army Medical Corps, received the Navy Cross for actions during Operation Enduring Freedom in Kandahar province when her convoy came under sustained enemy fire. While others sought cover, Captain Torres moved into the open, performing emergency field surgery on 14 soldiers with injuries incompatible with survival. Using only the equipment available in a forward operating base, she performed hemorrhage control, airway management, and emergency thoracotomy in active combat conditions. All 14 soldiers under her care survived and were evacuated. For extraordinary heroism and selfless service, the Department of Defense awarded her the Navy Cross. The colonel paused. The citation also notes 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained during that operation. Sergeant Davis, propped in the wheelchair, looked at Rachel with something like recognition finally finding its proper name. "Captain Torres," he said clearly. "Call sign Reaper 6. I knew it. I knew it the second you put that needle in my chest." The 2-star general came to attention. His posture shifted from command presence to something deeper, respect rendered as a physical act. He raised his hand to his forehead and saluted, the kind of salute that acknowledges not rank but legend. "Captain," he said, "the Pentagon has requested your presence in Washington in 2 days. The President wants to thank the officer who saved Sergeant Davis and protected the intelligence he was carrying. It wasn't just his life, it was what he knew." Dr. Mercer tried to interrupt. "Sir, I appreciate the background, but her unauthorized." "Did I ask you to speak, Doctor?" The general's eyes moved to him like a turret rotating, and Mercer's words died in his throat. "Your hospital will be receiving correspondence from the Pentagon regarding your conduct toward a superior officer. My advice would be to consult an attorney." The hallway was absolutely silent. A nurse 3 positions away was filming on her phone. She'd started recording when the MPs appeared, her hand steady as a surgeon's, capturing everything: the general's salute, Mercer's interruption, the revelation of Rachel's service crystallizing in real time. She didn't think about it, didn't second-guess the impulse. She just knew that what she was witnessing needed to be documented. By that evening, she'd uploaded it to YouTube with the title, "Doctor Humiliates Decorated War Hero Nurse." By midnight, it had 40,000 views. By dawn, it had 200,000. By noon, it had 2 million. She saved 14 soldiers. He questioned if she passed her boards. He called a Navy Cross recipient temp. What is wrong with this man? His contempt for her is clinical. Like he calculated exactly how to destroy her. CNN picked up the story before lunch. Anderson Cooper led the segment. Every comment section erupted with the kind of fury that only revealed hypocrisy can generate. People who'd watched Mercer's casual cruelty in that vending machine hallway, heard his voice dripping with contempt, and then learned exactly who he'd been contemning. Cedar Creek Medical's phone lines were overwhelmed. The hospital board called an emergency meeting at 2 in the afternoon. Dr. Mercer sat in the conference room with his attorney, trying to explain that he had no way of knowing her background, that her behavior had been insubordinate regardless, that he was simply maintaining professional standards. But the emails had leaked, the ones he'd sent to other hospitals, poisoning Rachel's reputation, his systematic campaign documented in timestamps and carefully worded phrases that all meant the same thing: this nurse needs to be destroyed. His own competence had built a perfect paper trail. Every calculated move was now evidence. Every phone call was recorded. Every schedule change was logged. Then Dr. Robert Chen called the hospital board directly. Chen was retired now, 71 years old, had trained Mercer 20 years ago at Emory Medical School. Chen had served as a trauma surgeon in 3 combat deployments. Chen had seen what real medicine looked like when the stakes were a human life and the tools were whatever you could salvage from the wreckage. "I saw the video," Chen said to the board chair, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of accumulated respect. "I taught this man that medicine is service. That rank and credentials matter less than skill and dedication. That a nurse with the right instincts can save lives that doctors would let slip away." He learned nothing. Or worse, he learned everything and chose to weaponize it. Chen paused. I trained him. That's my responsibility. But you need to remove him. Today. The investigation was merciless because the evidence was so clear. Mercer's systematic nature, the very thing that had made him effective as a saboteur, now worked against him. Every documented communication, every strategic schedule change, every poisoned phone call was a brick in the wall of sustained harassment against a decorated officer. Within a week, he was suspended pending investigation. Within a month, his medical privileges were permanently revoked. His fellowship standing was withdrawn. His reputation, built methodically over 2 decades, was destroyed in days. 6 months later, a nurse leaving the evening shift spotted him in the parking lot, loading boxes of medical supply equipment into a van. Dr. Mercer, no longer trusted to touch patients, was delivering equipment to the hospitals where he'd once commanded operating rooms. The fall from surgeon to delivery driver was complete and public and irreversible. Rachel stood in the Oval Office 2 days later in her army dress uniform, the Navy Cross and Purple Heart displayed on her chest, exactly where they belonged. Emma stood beside her in a navy dress, small and solemn and proud, wearing the faded 10th Mountain Division patch pinned above her heart, the one that had been sewn inside Rachel's jacket lining, a secret that was secret no longer. The patch had traveled 8 years in the darkness between fabric, waiting for the moment it could be displayed in the light. The president shook Rachel's hand. His grip was firm, his smile genuine, the kind of photograph that would appear in newspapers across the country, a president thanking a soldier, a woman in uniform, a mother who had chosen service even when service meant silence. Sergeant Davis stood beside her, recovering steadily, his hand in a salute that held respect and something deeper, gratitude that went beyond language. You saved my life twice. Once in that hospital. Once before when the intelligence I was carrying came from a source you developed during deployment. He lowered his hand. My family owes you everything. The mission that Rachel thought she destroyed by breaking cover had actually succeeded. The intelligence Davis had carried, the reason he'd been sent to Cedar Creek Medical, the whole reason Rachel's handler had placed her there as a temp, that operation had proceeded to completion. Davis's survival was the priority, and Rachel's cover was always expendable if it came to that choice. Some missions could only succeed if the operative was willing to be exposed. That evening, back in her apartment in Atlanta, Rachel sat at the same kitchen table where Emma had found her crying 2 days before. But now Emma understood. She held her mother's hand and traced the Purple Heart on her chest, her small fingers gentle on the ribbon. Were you scared? Emma asked. Every day, Rachel said. That's how you know it matters. Cedar Creek Medical sent a formal apology and a job offer, Director of Emergency Medicine, with a significant salary increase and full authority to restructure the department. Rachel declined politely. She'd already received new orders. Her next assignment was waiting, and some callings run deeper than civilian work, no matter how necessary that work was. The final scene was Fort Benning, where Rachel was teaching a new generation of combat medics. Her limp was pronounced as she moved, the legacy of a wound in Kandahar that had never fully healed but had never slowed her down. She was demonstrating needle decompression on a mannequin, her hands moving through the technique with the kind of precision that comes from having performed it under fire, with actual blood and actual lives on the line. A young specialist first class asked why she'd left civilian nursing to return to active duty. Rachel paused. She looked at her hands, at the calluses that neither scrubs nor time could smooth away. She thought of Sergeant Davis breathing because of her 42nd intervention. She thought of 14 soldiers in Kandahar who came home because she'd been willing to move into the open when everyone else was seeking cover. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she said. She guided the young medic's hands into position, showing them the 45-degree angle, the pressure point, the exact moment you know the needle is in the right place. That's why we do this. That's why we come back, no matter how many times we're asked to leave. Her hands, still calloused, still steady, moved with the precision of someone who had learned that medicine wasn't performed in the safety of a hospital with colleagues and equipment and backup plans. Medicine was performed in the dark, under fire, with your hands and your training and your willingness to die if it meant someone else lived. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now would be an incredible time. We post stories like this every single day, stories about people whose quiet strength changes everything. Please like this video, comment below about whether you would have made Rachel's choice, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.